Well, this Autopen stuff, Trump loves to talk about it. He even has Joe Biden's portrait up in the White House, and it's a picture of the Autopen, which is hilarious, by the way. But he's always talking about how Joe Biden's Autopen executive orders, they're all null and void. And the pardons, they're all null and void. But it's one thing to say it, it's another thing to have that actually be true. Let's ask Alex about that. Joining me now, Alex Swoyer, author of the book Lawless Lawfare. She writes, well, she's the editor at large for the Washington Times. All right, Alex, how does this work? Can he do this? Is he doing this? I don't understand.
I think that he is going to try. And so I think the answer is yes and no, to be direct. So he can pretty much outdo, reverse all of President Biden's executive orders. We see presidents do this all the time, right? Usually when a new administration comes in, they do away with what the prior administration did by executive order. That's why they always say try to go through Congress because it sticks. And so with Biden's auto pen, when it comes to executive orders, yes, Trump can just reverse those. When it comes to legislation that might have been signed by the Autopen or pardons, that's quite different. And in fact, I was doing a little bit of research because this question has come up so much, and there looks like there's actually precedent. I think it dates back all the way to the 1800s, but in relation to pardons, something to the effect, I'm guessing it was a little bit of dicta. I need to like dig into the case more, but that pardons are pretty permanent, and that there's nothing that says in the Constitution that it must be signed by an real signature rather than an auto pen. So, I think that there's a hard chance that the president can make an argument that he can reverse President Biden's pardons. But of course, I love to cover the Supreme Court. And if a challenge like that were to arise, it would be one of my highlights to cover for sure. Another unprecedented Trump case.
Well, well, good. Let's talk about what you love, the Supreme Court, because Trump is banking on some W's there for some things that are coming down the pike. You've written about this. What's coming? Are we going to win? Are we going to cry?
Yeah, so you know what? There's some interesting cases that are pending, waiting for decisions right away. So, first of all, we've talked about the Trump tariff issue. I think you and I have talked before about that. And so, really, the Supreme Court could issue a decision on President Trump's argument that he has to implement tariffs in a way that's based on emergency powers, essentially, that he cites the trade deficit and the issue with fentanyl flowing in the country. Now, small businesses had challenged that. They had said, no, it's really Congress that should be the one that they lay and collect taxes. They should be the ones that have the authority with tariffs. So though that has been before the justices, they could really issue a ruling anytime. And I know the president, the administration wants them to do so, so they can go ahead and, further their tariff agenda. So that's one that could come anytime. The other one that is super interesting, obviously, with all the news about the National Guardsmen being shot here in DC, is there's a case before the Supreme Court pending about the president's attempt to deploy National Guard to Chicago. So that's been briefed. Anytime the justices could really, like, I mean, today they could issue a decision and order about whether the president has the authority to issue National Guardsmen to Chicago. And we see this in lower courts. I think we've talked about how DC courts have ruled. There's also been appellate courts out in the Ninth Circuit. We've seen challenges with LA, Portland, various cities that have been fighting this. And so, how the Supreme Court rules, it'll be very important. It'll be guidance for lower courts if they go in other cities, for example. And then lastly, one of the topics that has been huge is the whole gerrymandering issue with like the Texas map and California. I'm sure you've covered this. We might have talked about this previously, but the Texas map is actually before the Supreme Court, and they let it, the one where basically Republicans were able to, I think there's like 5 new seats that they were able to maneuver by changing district lines. And the Supreme Court has allowed, at least temporarily, for that new map to take effect. And so now that those briefs are in, they could issue a decision whether or not to stay that way, stay the course, or to reverse that and halt the new map. And that's just interesting because we know, California is doing the same, trying to cancel out 5 Republican seats. We're going to probably see other states, blue and red, try to do the same. So how the Supreme Court comes down there will also be interesting guidance going forward.
Alex, I know you probably hate it when I ask you this, but I always have to ask. I'm uniquely interested in those gerrymandering cases because it's the House of Representatives at stake here. Do you have any kind of a sense of which way that's going to go? Surely they're not going to do something like allow California to do it and not allow Texas, right?
Right. That's absolutely true. Now, the way that these cases are getting before the justices are that people are making arguments that the way that the lines are redrawn is basically racial discrimination. So a lot of these gerrymandering cases get before the court because they have to make basically a voting rights or a civil rights argument. The court already has a case before it right now pending that they heard oral arguments in earlier this I think it was at the start of the term in October, if I remember right. And it has to do with maps out of Louisiana. And essentially, if they're going to do away with part of the Voting Rights Act, which deals with the majority minority districts, a group of white voters have basically challenged, or non-black voters, and said that having a second minority district has disenfranchised. It basically violated the 14th Amendment, that they're using race as a factor in drawing these lines, and that that's unconstitutional. So how they come down on that could impact what they do with these gerrymandering cases, because if they, were to say yes, like we side with these voters in Louisiana, that really makes some of these claims trying to challenge any gerrymandering maps hard because they have to point to race or racial discrimination in doing so. They can't point really to partisan or political gerrymandering. The court has previously said, that that's a political question. That's not one for the courts to decide. So it kind of looks like the only way to really get your gerrymandering case before the justices is to find some sort of racial undertone. So we're going to have to kind of see if the justices have any sort of appetite for that.
Do we have any sense about this idea of birthright citizenship, and if this is something the Supreme Court's finally going to be done with? Because this is so, we can't have a country like this. Please tell me they're going to address this situation.
I feel like, Jesse, I feel like you ask me this every few times that we get to talk. And every time I'm
I
like,
do.
I would love to be able, like I said, to cover the Autopen challenge. I would love to be able to cover the Birthright citizenship challenge, but I really have no idea what the court would do. Usually they take cases where there's been circuit splits, where courts have ruled certain different ways on issues. And my understanding is I have an immigration reporter. He's actually our editor, our political editor, Stephen Dinan at the Washington Times. He covers this in and out. So he's the expert with how the lower courts have been treating the birthright citizenship issue. But my understanding is I think many of them have ruled against the administration. So it's more likely than not the justices wouldn't want to touch something unless there's a circuit split. We'll see. I'd have to go back and look at my notes and check on that, but yet to be determined. That's one of the things I always look at is how have lower courts treated this. If there's any confusion in lower courts, then yes, there's usually a likelihood that the justices will weigh in.
What about Letitia James? Is she finally going to go to jail?
Yeah, so the whole Letitia James Comey situation with the Clinton appointee basically dismissing those indictments, it's very interesting because the whole, I guess, critics of these indictments could argue, and they tried to argue, is that these two individuals can't be re-indicted as well, specifically Comey, because of the statute of limitations. However, there is a federal law that says that if there was a technicality with a charging document, that there's like I guess, a 6-month extension. So I could see the administration making that argument, but first possibly trying to go back with a new U.S. attorney, someone else in Lindsay Halligan's position, and presenting to the grand jury, getting a new indictment, and then trying to make that argument citing the federal law that, hey, the first charging document had errors. We get 6 more months to correct that, and here we have a new indictment. Now with Letitia James, her case is a little different. She doesn't have the statute of limitations rule. So just like I mentioned with the replacement of Lindsay Halligan, whoever wants to step in that position, even someone from the Justice Department, I guess, since we're talking about mortgage fraud, could come in here and present the case again to a grand jury, get another indictment, and go forward prosecuting her. So, I think she's more in a tough position than Comey, just because he can try to rely on that statute of limitations argument. But yes, I would not be surprised if the Trump administration goes and tries to get new indictments for both of them, because really it's the process is part of the punishment, and drawing this out for either, Comey or James is part of what the president and his administration would like to do.
Good. That made me feel better. Thanks, Alex. I appreciate it. I would thank you for coming to my YouTube channel, but I know how brilliant it is, and I know you love it here. So subscribe and watch. We're going to start really ramping things up and putting some funny stuff, some interesting stuff out there, some collaborations. Either way, my YouTube channel is officially the place to be. So stick around.